Welcome back to the Explainer for July 3rd, 2026. So today, we're diving into what is honestly a pretty incredible tool for auditors, ISO 14001:2026's Annex A3. Look, if you apply this right, it totally transforms how we evaluate environmental management systems. We're talking about moving away from those rigid, static frameworks and turning them into dynamic drivers of actual, real-world environmental performance.
But first, let me ask you a quick question. Have you ever, frustrated a client by making completely unrealistic documentation demands? Or actually, flip that around. Have you ever walked away from an audit feeling great, only to realize way later that you totally missed a massive systemic flaw? Hey, it happens to the absolute best of us. The difference between an audit that adds real value and one that just gives everyone an administrative headache? Well, it usually comes down to exactly how we're interpreting the standard.
All right, let's jump right into our roadmap. We're going to hit the Annex A3 advantage, rethink continual improvement, demystify that tricky life cycle perspective, and apply the proportionality principle. And then we'll wrap the whole thing up by looking at how to avoid audit misclassification.
Okay, Section 1, the Annex A3 Advantage, your ultimate interpretive guide. We all know that misinterpreting ISO 14001:2026 leads to some pretty bad audits, but luckily we've got a secret weapon.
And that secret weapon is Annex A3 itself. Now notice right away that it's explicitly a non-mandatory guide. So this isn't just a list of new, rigid rules to force on an organization, right? Instead, think of it as providing conceptual clarification. It's basically a lens that reduces all that subjective variability between different auditors. It completely prevents that dreaded checklist-based auditing and makes sure we're making balanced, risk-based judgments. Moving right along to Section 2, Rethinking Continual Improvement. Strategic enhancement versus fixing errors. We really need to talk about this because auditors constantly misunderstand what the word improvement actually means here.
Okay, look at the stark contrast here. It is so common for organizations to think continual improvement just means closing out corrective actions. Like patching a leaking pipe or retraining staff after a chemical spill. But wait, that's really just fixing an isolated error. Continual improvement, as A3 clarifies, is proactive. It's the strategic enhancement of the system's suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. It's not patching the leak, it's entirely redesigning the plumbing so the leak literally can't happen again. Because here's the thing, continual improvement does not mean every single environmental metric like waste tonnage or whatever has to magically drop every single year. Sometimes, maintaining stable performance is the improvement, provided they're boosting the system's underlying capability. So you want to look for things like, are they enhancing data monitoring accuracy? Are they improving employee behavioral competence? When you see a company optimizing their risk controls or refining how they evaluate suppliers, that is a massive win. You absolutely have to recognize that.
On to Section 3, Demystifying Life Cycle Perspective. Practical influence, not complex science. I know this concept gives organizations and auditors a ton of anxiety, so let's just break it down.
The standard makes a super crucial distinction for us here. A life cycle perspective is not, I repeat, is not a full life cycle assessment. You absolutely do not need to demand complex, scientific, quantitative modeling of every single environmental footprint to confirm conformance. Annex A3 points us towards something way more pragmatic. It's just about considering the upstream and downstream impacts the organization can actually influence. So think practical reach, not complex science. So how do we practically audit this? Well, first, check how the organization identifies stages they can actually control. Second, evaluate their procurement and supplier criteria. And third, look at product design and end of life. A classic example from the source material is a logistics company. Obviously, they can't control how the delivery trucks they buy are manufactured, right? That's totally out of their hands. But they can absolutely control route optimization to save fuel, and they can set supplier criteria for the fuel they buy. Boom! That is applying a life cycle perspective effectively.
Section 4. The proportionality principle. Scale your controls to your risks. This is a brilliant reminder that the standard is incredibly flexible. It was never meant to be a one-size-fits-all administrative nightmare.
Check out this breakdown. It really helps build a realistic audit strategy. If you're auditing a small consulting firm, their risk level is super low. Maybe some office waste, a bit of energy use, so their proportional controls should just be simple procedures, maybe just monitoring their monthly energy bills. But compare that to a heavy chemical plant. High risks, toxicity, emissions, the whole shebang. They absolutely require robust documentation, real-time sensor networks, and frequent audits. Proportionality is just absolutely key. It ensures organizations allocate their resources to maximize actual environmental benefit rather than just endlessly chasing paperwork. I mean, if you walk into a tiny mom-and-pop enterprise and demand multinational level documentation, you're going to derail the entire audit and completely miss the intent of the standard. We have to scale our expectations to their localized risks, period.
And finally, Section 5, avoiding audit misclassification by using A3 for accurate judgments. So how do we take these three lenses we just talked about and use them to avoid making the wrong calls?
Well, when we wrap up an audit, we're basically sorting our findings into three buckets, right? Nonconformities, opportunities for improvement, and positive practices. Think of Annex A3 as your ultimate calibration tool. It helps us sort those findings accurately, completely stripping away the bias of standardized expectations that just don't fit the specific organization in front of us.
Applying this stops us from falling into some really common auditing traps. First, we stop misclassifying stable metrics as a nonconformity. Remember, stability isn't stagnation if process reliability is up. Second, we start accepting simple documentation for low-risk aspects. Please, don't write a nonconformity just because a small office doesn't have a 50-page manual. Third, partial life cycle consideration, totally acceptable if their market influence is genuinely limited. And finally, whatever you do, don't overlook those innovative positive practices. Recognizing the good stuff drives a culture of true excellence. We really only want to penalize genuine failures to meet intended outcomes.
This quote from the source material just hits the nail on the head. Conceptual clarity ensures that environmental management systems are evaluated based on effectiveness in achieving intended environmental outcomes, rather than superficial conformity to rigid documentation expectations. That right there is the whole ballgame. This is exactly why Annex A3 matters. It protects the credibility of the entire ISO certification process by keeping us focused on real-world impact. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to take into your next gig. On your next site visit, are you going to audit for superficial compliance, or are you going to use Annex A3 to drive genuine environmental effectiveness? Think about it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. Keep learning, keep asking those great questions, and I'll catch you in the next one.